Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with the very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. We're stepping into a time when people feared bathing more than plague, when garlic could double as perfume, and when your neighbor might literally throw strange things out the window and call it normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself approaching a medieval city, not in a dream, not through a painting, but truly, fully, arriving at its edge on foot the way nearly everyone did back then. Your boots are dusty from the road, the sun is somewhere overhead, and you are about to experience something that no history book diagram or Hollywood film has ever really prepared you for. It is not the sight that greets you first. It is not the stone walls rising grey and ancient from the earth. Not the banners catching lazily in the breeze, not even the distant sound of voices and cartwheels and the low, indifferent moan of livestock. No, what reaches you first is the smell. And it reaches you long before you are anywhere near the gates. It arrives like something physical, like something that has weight and intention, a slow, creeping wave of sensation that your nose registers before your mind has even had time to make sense of it. It is a horrible symphony, and every instrument in it is playing at once. Rotting meat. Somewhere not far enough away, human sweat, not the clean, honest sweat of a single afternoon, but something older and deeper. Baked layer upon layer into heavy wool that has perhaps never truly dried, and beneath that, beneath all of it, the rich, unmistakable presence of horse manure, of vegetables in various states of quiet decay, and something sharper, something bright and sour that the sun has been working on all morning. The unmistakable tang of urine, rising slow and patient from the stones and the earth and the walls themselves, and it clings to you. That is perhaps the most disorienting part of it. The smell does not simply pass through you the way a breeze might. It settles. It wraps itself around you like a second skin, and you are not even through the city gates yet. This is not a small or incidental detail of medieval life. This is the texture of it, the atmosphere in which every meal was eaten, every conversation was had, every prayer was whispered, and every child was born. The stench was not background noise. It was the foreground. It was the very air that this world breathed in and breathed out without pause or apology. We have been sold, for quite a long time now, a rather different version of this world. Hollywood gave us clean, shaven knights in gleaming armor, castles with something approaching tidiness, and a general sense that the people of the 14th century had somehow arrived at the same understanding of cleanliness that we carry with us now, just without the plumbing. That version is, let's say, a generous interpretation. The real 14th century had an unrelenting, nose-searing thatch that was simply part of life. As unremarkable to the people living inside it as the hum of electricity is to us now. Something you stopped noticing precisely because you could not escape it. And yet, here is what makes this world so endlessly fascinating, so worth settling in and exploring on a quiet night like this one. The people living inside that smell were not passive. They were not unaware. They had opinions about cleanliness, and fears about it, and rituals around it, and a whole rich, sometimes baffling, sometimes surprisingly logical inner life devoted to questions of the body and how best to tend to it. They just arrived at some very different answers than we might, and tonight, slowly, with no particular urgency, we are going to find out why. So pull your blanket a little closer. Let your breathing slow, and let that imagined medieval city sit there on the edge of your awareness, smelling exactly as it always did, waiting patiently for us to step inside. But before we step through those gates, let's just pause for a moment and gently dismantle something, because there is a version of this story that gets told rather often, and it goes something like this. Medieval people were dirty. They knew they were dirty. They did not particularly mind being dirty, and they shuffled cheerfully through their short, unwashed lives without giving the matter very much thought at all. That version is almost entirely wrong. The people of the medieval world had medical guides, actual written texts devoted to questions of health and cleanliness. They had opinions about the body and how to care for it. They had daily rituals and strong feelings about dirt and smell and propriety. They tried, genuinely and with some effort, to keep themselves as clean as circumstances would allow. The problem was not indifference. The problem was that the understanding they were working from, the theoretical framework sitting beneath all of their careful, intentioned decisions, was spectacularly, catastrophically incorrect, and nowhere is that more quietly devastating than in the story of what happened to bathing. In the early part of the medieval period, bathing was not a suspicious activity. It was not a moral failing, or a sign of weakness, or an invitation to disaster. It was simply a reasonable thing that a reasonable person might do. Monasteries had bathhouses, warm, practical spaces where monks could attend to the body with the same orderly care they gave to the soul, and beyond the monastery walls. In the wider, messier world of towns and markets and muddy roads, the old Roman tradition still lingered, that long, slow inheritance of the idea that soaking and scrubbing were good for you, that warm water was a kind of medicine, that the body tended to with care would reward you for the trouble. It is rather a pleasant image if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. The early medieval world, imperfect and difficult in so many ways, but at least in this one particular corner, holding on to something sensible, and then, slowly, incrementally, across the long arc of the medieval centuries, something shifted. By the time the late medieval period arrived, the relationship between people and bathwater had changed in a way that is almost difficult to absorb. Bathing had moved, in the collective imagination, from healthy to hazardous, not through laziness, not through carelessness, but through a very specific, very sincerely held belief about how the human body worked, a belief that was logical on its own terms, internally consistent, and wrong in almost every possible way. Here is what people genuinely believed. Hot water opened the pores of the skin. That part, as it happens, is more or less true, or close enough to true that you can understand why someone might think it. The skin responds to warmth. It softens. Something does happen at the surface of the body when you lower it into a hot bath. And the medieval mind, observing this, reached for an explanation. And the explanation it reached for was this: open pores were a door, and doors, as anyone knows, let things in. If the pores of your skin were standing open, wide and receptive and warm, then whatever was present in the air around you, whatever invisible, malevolent something was drifting through the streets and settling on surfaces and moving between bodies in the crowded, breathing closeness of a medieval town, could simply walk in, seep through the open door of your skin and take up quiet residence inside you, and in a world where disease arrived without explanation and left without warning. In a world where a healthy person could be dead within days, and no one could tell you why or how to stop it. That fear was not abstract. It was immediate, it was rational within its own framework, and it was absolutely terrifying. Imagine, for a moment, that you are living through a plague outbreak. The Black Death has already moved through parts of Europe, like something out of a nightmare. Whole streets emptied, whole families reduced to silence, and no one, not the physicians, not the priests, not the scholars with their careful Latin texts, can tell you with any confidence what is causing it, or how it travels from one body to the next. And in this moment of profound, helpless uncertainty, someone tells you that hot water opens your pores, that immersing your body in a warm bath is essentially the same as throwing open every window and door of your house during a storm, and inviting whatever is outside to come in and make itself at home. Would you bathe? Probably not. You would stay dry. You would stay closed. You would keep your pores sealed and your body defended against an enemy you could not see and did not understand. And you would feel, in doing so, not dirty, not negligent, but sensible, careful, even cautious in a way that felt like wisdom. This was the mindset, and it was held not by the foolish or the ignorant, but by ordinary people doing their sincere, frightened best with the information available to them. Bathing too often, they feared, would weaken the body, leave it porous and vulnerable and open to whatever the world wished to push through those unguarded doors. Water in this worldview was not cleansing, it was treacherous, and so the early medieval bathhouse, that warm, practical, Roman-tinged space of ordinary hygiene, began its long, slow transformation into something else entirely, something viewed with suspicion, something to be avoided by the prudent and the pious alike, not because the people who stopped bathing were lazy, not because they loved being dirty, but because staying dry felt, in every way that mattered to them, like staying safe. There is something almost unbearably human about that, the willingness to endure discomfort, to accept an unwashed life, not out of indifference but out of genuine, deeply felt, entirely misplaced care for one's own survival. They were trying to protect themselves, with the wrong map, navigating a real and dangerous world using directions that pointed steadily, confidently, in exactly the wrong direction. And we will follow them a little further into that world, in just a moment, and while the body itself was navigating all of that fear and superstition, and carefully reasoned avoidance of warm water, the clothing wrapped around it had its own story to tell, a story that is, in its own quiet way, just as exhausting. By the later part of the Middle Ages, a small but meaningful development had arrived in the form of the linen undergarment. Thin, close-fitting layers worn beneath the heavier wool and leather of everyday outer clothing. And the beauty of linen, the genuinely practical, life-improving beauty of it, was that it could be changed regularly, independently of the outer garments, without the full, laborious body involving ordeal of washing everything at once, which was fortunate, because washing the outer garments was an ordeal of rather considerable proportion. It was not a matter of dropping something into a basin and waiting. It was not quiet or gentle or particularly dignified. Medieval laundry was a physical contest, a full-body negotiation between a person and a pile of heavy, resistant, thoroughly reluctant fabric, and the fabric did not always cooperate. The clothes went into large tubs, and then they were trampled, feet moving rhythmically through the wet weight of wool, pressing and shifting, and pushing the water through the fibers the way that patience and repetition and the entire lower half of your body sometimes can, and when the trampling was not sufficient. When the stains held on with the particular stubbornness that stains in the medieval world apparently possessed, the beating began, sticks raised and brought down again and again against the soaking cloth, the kind of rhythmic, effortful labour that leaves your arms aching and your back quietly furious by the end of the afternoon. And then, in the rinsing, something rather lovely happened. Flowers, lavender, most often, dropped into the water and allowed to drift slowly through the wet fabric, a small, deliberate, entirely human gesture towards something better than what the day had actually offered. The smell of clean linen and lavender in a medieval household was not an accident, it was an aspiration, something reached for with intention by people who understood perfectly well the difference between the world as it was and the world as they would prefer it to smell. There is something quietly moving about that detail, the lavender in the rinse water, the insistence on some small softness in the middle of a great deal of difficulty. But the tub, that large, heavy, water-filled tub, was itself a luxury not everyone possessed. For those without one, and there were many, laundry meant a journey, down to the nearest river, the nearest lake, the nearest stream willing to receive an armful of dirty wool without too much complaint. And this too was labour of a significant and unglamorous kind, hauling wet fabric through streets and fields, finding a suitable spot along the bank, kneeling at the water's edge in whatever weather the season had decided to provide, and doing the whole trampling, beating, rinsing process all over again, only now with a riverbank beneath you instead of a floor, and moving water instead of a tub, and absolutely no control over who or what else might be using that same stretch of river at the same time. Which brings us, gently and with some pleasure, to the Prior of Coventry. Sometime in the 15th century, an unnamed but clearly very exasperated prior found himself composing what can only be described as a formal complaint, directed at the people of his town, for the specific and repeatedly committed offence of washing their clothes in his fish pond, and the fish, as fish tend to do when their home is suddenly filled with dirty laundry and lavender water, and the rhythmic beating of sticks, were not thriving. They were, in fact, dying, and the prior was not pleased. One imagines him standing at the edge of his pond on a grey Coventry morning, looking out at the floating fish and the floating laundry and the townspeople who had apparently decided that his private water feature was simply a public laundry facility with a fish problem, and composing his complaint with the particular combination of righteous indignation and barely contained disbelief that the situation so clearly warranted. It is, in a small way, a perfect window into the medieval world. The prior trying to maintain the dignity of his fish, the townspeople trying to get their washing done with whatever water was available, and everyone in their own way, doing what they had to do. London, at least, had made some provision for this. There was a jetty, a specific, designated, officially recognised spot along the water's edge, known as the Lavender Brick, where poor women were permitted to bring their laundry and wash it without complaint or consequence, and the city authorities protected access to this place, which tells you something rather interesting about how seriously the question of laundry was taken by those in charge. It was not an afterthought. It was infrastructure. Modest and unglamorous infrastructure, certainly. A jetty in a name and a degree of official permission, but infrastructure nonetheless. An acknowledgement that laundry was not a private inconvenience, but a communal necessity that required a communal solution. The women who gathered at the Lavender Brick came with their heavy loads, and their sticks and their tired arms, and they worked, in the cold and the damp and the particular grey light that London tends to offer in the place of sunshine, and they rinsed their things in the river, and carried them home again. And if the lavender made it into the water too, then perhaps the walk back smelled a little better than the walk there. But if the Lavender Brick represents the modest dignity of medieval laundry at its most organised, then the nurses of Paris represent something else entirely. At a large hospital in the city, the women responsible for washing the bedding and the towels, the heavy, soaked, endlessly demanding fabric of a working hospital, had to carry that washing to the River Seine, in winter, in the dead of it, when the mud along the riverbanks had gone treacherous with cold, when the ground beneath your feet could not be trusted to stay still, when the water itself carried a kind of threat in its temperature that had nothing to do with pause or superstition and everything to do with simple, immediate physics. The mud was so slippery, the banks so unpredictable, that these women could not go alone. They were accompanied by a designated guardian, someone whose specific purpose was to be present in case a nurse lost her footing on that frozen, muddy bank and went into the water. Someone whose job it was to stand between a person and the river and make sure the river did not win. Think about that for a moment and let it settle. People were risking their lives to do laundry, not in some dramatic or celebrated way, not with any particular glory attached to it, but in the ordinary, grinding, absolutely essential way that invisible labour has always been risked and performed and largely forgotten. Nurses on a frozen riverbank in Paris. Mud under their feet, icy water beneath them, a guardian beside them, and an armful of hospital bedding that needed to be cleaned by morning. The lavender in the rinse water was a long way away from here, but the intention was the same reaching for something cleaner than what the day had given, the same insistence, quiet and exhausted and entirely unrecorded, that it mattered, that cleanliness was worth the trouble, even when the trouble was a frozen river and a treacherous bank, and a guardian whose presence was the only thing standing between you and something far worse than dirty linen. And yet, not everyone in this unwashed world was quite so unwashed, because the medieval period was not a single, uniform experience of grime and avoidance and wrong map navigation. It was a collection of different worlds, different habits, different ideas about the body and what the body deserved, and nowhere is that more quietly startling than in the contrast between two groups of people who lived in close, often violent, frequently antagonistic proximity to one another, and who held, it turns out, completely opposite views on the question of personal cleanliness. The Christian writers of the early medieval period had a great deal to say about the Vikings, and almost none of it was flattering. They were wicked, they were savage, they arrived without warning, and left with your valuables and your sense of security, and any optimism you might have been quietly nurturing about the stability of the world. The written record, shaped almost entirely by the people the Vikings were raiding, painted a portrait of a people beyond the pale of civilized behavior, pagans in the most alarming sense of the word, ungoverned, ungodly, and almost certainly unwashed. There is, it must be said, a certain irony in this, because the Anglo-Saxons who regarded the Vikings with such comprehensive disapproval, the Saxons who shook their heads at the barbarism of these northern raiders and composed their indignant chronicles accordingly, were, by most available evidence, bathing perhaps once or twice in a year, and the Vikings, the supposedly savage, uncivilized, morally deficient Vikings, were doing something rather different. Among the most common objects recovered from Viking burial mounds, those carefully assembled collections of everything a person might need for the journey beyond this life, are not weapons, not treasures, not the dramatic artifacts of conquest and glory. They are grooming tools, razors, tweezers, combs of fine, close-toothed bone or antler, and something called an ear spoon, a long, slender implement, sometimes called an ear pick or ear scoop, carried not tucked away in a bag somewhere but worn on a chain around the neck, immediately accessible. The kind of object you keep close because you use it regularly and consider it as essential as anything else you might carry through the day. It was used, with admirable practicality, to remove wax from the ears, and sometimes, with equal practicality, to clean beneath the fingernails. The Vikings also made soap, a specialized soap containing lye, used not merely for cleaning but for something rather more deliberate, bleaching the hair and beards to a pale, fashionable blondness, which served the double purpose of looking exactly as a Viking apparently wished to look, and keeping the hair free of lice at the same time. Practical, vain effective, and considerably more sophisticated than the written record produced by their Saxon observers would ever have suggested, a 13th century chronicle noted, with what reads very much like bafflement, that the Danes, with their habits of combing their hair every day, bathing every Saturday, and regularly changing their clothes, were proving entirely too appealing to the women of the communities they moved through, undermining the virtue of married women, and seducing the daughters of nobles, and one cannot help but read that observation and think, of course they combed their hair every day. But here is the thing about all of it: the Saxon avoidance and the Viking grooming, and the prior and his fish, and the nurses on the frozen sign, and the lavender in the rinse water, and the paws that people believed were doors. Here is the thing that sits beneath all of these stories like a quiet current. These people lived fully, completely, loudly, tenderly, stubbornly lived inside all of it. Inside the wool that never quite dried, and the streets that smelled of things we would prefer not to name, and the bathhouses shuttered on moral grounds, and the water that everyone agreed was probably trying to kill you. They raised children in rooms where animals also slept, and they loved those children with everything they had. They composed poetry, actual, careful, considered poetry, in languages that had already lived for centuries and would go on living for centuries more. They invented things and argued about things, and prayed about things, and built things that are still standing now, which is more than can be said for most of what we build. They scrubbed their souls more often than their feet, because the soul, in their understanding, was the more urgent project. They trusted rosemary, tucked it into clothing, and pressed it into floors, and carried it close in the belief that something fragrant and green and growing was a form of protection as real as anything else available to them. And when all of that was not quite enough, when the rosemary and the dried flowers and the carefully placed herbs had done what they could, and the world still smelled exactly as it always had, they made perfume out of what they had, out of necessity and ingenuity, and the very human refusal to simply accept that this was as good as it was going to get. Their noses adapted, as noses will, As all of us adapt to the particular textures of the world we happen to have been born into, and they pushed forward. Through the stench and the cold and the wrong maps and the fish ponds and the frozen rivers, with the same stubbornness that people in every century have pushed forward, through the particular difficulties of their particular moment. But for all the grime and odour, there's something oddly comforting in the resilience. The medieval world was many things: dangerous, raw, uncomfortable. But it was also resourceful. People adapted, noses adapted, and in a strange way, the history of hygiene is the history of how humanity pushed forward despite the stink. So tonight, as you slip into your own clean sheets, surrounded by the faint whir of a fan and the scent of fabric softener, maybe take a moment to appreciate the little things: your toothbrush, your soap, your toilet with plumbing that goes somewhere far, far away, and if you dream of medieval times, try not to breathe too deeply. Good night.